Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Lahav Harkov, Senior Political Correspondent at Jewish Insider. Lahav, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
To remind our viewers, you and I talked a few days after October 7th, and I want to talk about what life is like right now inside of Israel. Can you tell us about the last few weeks and what's changed?
Yeah, over the last few weeks, I think like in the days after we last talked, it started to feel like the country was sort of emptying of all of its young men. Or not even young men; it's men between 18 and 40, more or less. Anyone who had served in a combat role and many other roles have been called up to the IDF. More than 100% have reported to reserve duty. And you also saw plane loads of Jewish people and Israelis from around the world just coming in to do reserve duty, even though, if someone lives outside the country, they're generally not really called up. So there is a little bit of a sense of, I've compared it to what people talk about, say, like in the U.S. in World War II, where there were no men around. The women had to like run the industries and things like that. So we're not there yet, but it does feel a little bit like that. And we're all home. We're all praying for our soldiers, and I think everybody's very, very worried about the hostages. That is the constant conversation in Israel about what will be with the hostages. Dozens of children as young as 9 months old are there, and elderly people and everyone in between. Israelis are very, very worried about the hostages and hope that we can bring them back soon. But at the same time, there's a sense of real unity and a real sense of a shared goal that we need to win this war, that we can no longer just try to contain the threat of Hamas and just tolerate it, just have, a short round of fighting and a ceasefire, because we see that they use those ceasefires to take the time to just build up their capabilities. And we want to stop having these rounds of fighting. We don't want this to be one war in a series.
I do want to get to the hostages in just a little bit. In my neighborhood in New York, we see the photos of the hostages. There's flyers hung of them, so they are top of mind for a lot of Americans too. But 3 weeks ago, you said the mood in Israel was a mixture of shock and anger. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's changed within the past 3 weeks, and a little bit more about what that mood is like now, if you could describe it in a few words?
I think, look, it's still shocking. It's still absolutely shocking what happened. I mean, it's not just the most Jews killed in one day since the Holocaust. It's the way they've been killed, and we're constantly hearing new things. I mean, the government is not yet finished with identifying all of the bodies, because some of them were, really burnt and mutilated. And are hard to identify. Just today, there were photos put out of teeth that were collected from the rubble of some of these kibbutzes where homes were burnt down, and the teeth are being used to try to identify some of the bodies. So that sorrow continues. But I think the anger has really sort of hardened into this determination that Israelis feel. There's a bit of domestic sort of internal anger where people want the government to take responsibility for its failures here. But I think that moving forward, we're going to see more of that, more of the sort of political side of things where people say, where were our leaders? It's just starting to sort of simmer now.
I do want to dive a little bit more into that. You said a few weeks ago the top question on everybody's mind is, how did this happen? Is there any more indication of how that happened? Is there any answers that Israel now knows 3 weeks out?
Like, I think the thing that we know more than anything else is that for, the past 15 years or so, Israel's leadership, both its military and defense leadership and its political leadership, have had this idea of what's happening in Gaza that has been false, that they thought that they could contain Hamas. They thought that Hamas was trying to, at some level, be a responsible leadership for Gaza, that if humanitarian aid was getting in, they were getting this aid money from Qatar and from the UN and elsewhere, then they could be deterred and they wouldn't try to start a real war with Israel. Every once in a while they'd shoot some rockets, which is horrible, right? Like, just saying it, like, you can't believe, but there was this mindset in Israel where they were like, we have the Iron Dome, we can handle some rockets, better not to have a war. And you can understand where that comes from, but ultimately it just allowed Hamas to build up its capabilities. And the sort of groupthink and the unwillingness to accept other ideas was clearly a problem.
What do you think is missing then from the international conversation when it comes to this war and when it comes to Hamas specifically?
First of all, I think, you were saying that there's these posters of the hostages in your neighborhood and that they're top of mind, but I don't think that they're top of the diplomatic conversation, the international conversation, whether in the media, in newspaper articles that I'm reading and segments from American and British television that I'm watching. I don't think that they're the top thing. And really they should be, because every single I watch the news in English and in Hebrew because those are the languages I know, right? Every single English-speaking country in the world has, except maybe not New Zealand, but the major ones have hostages in Gaza. They should all be talking about what is their government doing to try to bring home the hostages. And I don't think that that's top of mind. And I see that with the United States as well, which, they have more hostages than I think any country other than Israel. They should be talking about that. The number one effort should be to bring these people home. And instead, the focus is on trying to tie Israel's hands and trying to bring pauses or a ceasefire when, if there's a ceasefire now, then you're just going to have Hamas raise its head again later.
Let's talk about these hostages, because it's heartbreaking what is happening. There are hostages as young as 9 months old in Gaza right now, and there's over 200 of them. 5 hostages have returned to Israel so far. What has been Israel's reaction to this?
So 4 of the hostages were released by Hamas, and 1 was rescued by the Israeli army just a day before we're recording this. When the 4 were released, the first 2 were dual Israeli-U.S. citizens who live in the U.S. And it was at a time where there was talk about the U.S. trying to work out some sort of deal to just have U.S. citizens released. So it seemed like it was some sort of gesture, whether likely that came from pressure from Qatar, which sponsors Hamas, together with Iran. So it's likely that Qatar, because it has a fairly good relationship with the U.S., an excellent relationship with the U.S., they're considered a non-NATO ally nation. Despite being a major funder of a terrorist organization designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization. In any case, likely Qatar was doing this in order to try to maintain its relationship with the U.S., and my understanding is that it's continuing to try to pressure to release U.S. hostages. That being said, no civilian should be held hostage. No child, no grandmother, no mother or father. Nobody should be held hostage no matter what country they're a citizen of, right? And once again, as we are talking, there have been rumors today of dual citizens being released, but Israelis are people too, and Jews are people too. And the sense is that, Hamas might get away with it. I mean, they've already gotten away with it, but they might get away with it for even longer because they think they can get away with just releasing the dual citizens.
I guess that leads me to my next question. Are Israelis hopeful that all of the hostages will be released?
I think there's always hope. I think there are questions about the prices to pay. Right now, I think Israelis are very much willing to pay the price in a war. And so if there are daring rescues like we have seen Israel do over history, and Tebi, and in all sorts of other situations, I think that Israelis would support that. There is talk about Hamas wanting a prisoner swap, where terrorists who are sitting in prison in Israel would be swapped for civilians who have been taken hostage by Hamas. It's not really a prisoner swap, because that suggest some kind of equivalency here. But in any case, there's rumors that Hamas has asked for an all-for-all deal. In Israel, the government has said that it's not true, that even though Hamas is saying this on their social media channels, and there was also a hostage video that was released this week in which one of the Israeli hostages spoke about such a deal, but that when Israel is going through diplomatic channels with other countries, that deal is not actually on the table.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier because it's really just in my mind and I can't get it out. And you said that Americans don't think or some Americans, the media, some diplomats aren't saying that the hostages are top of mind. So where do you think that the media deficits are here?
Well, I think that maybe the war story is more exciting, sexy, bigger headlines. And the hostages, they wrote about the hostages, and maybe there's not something new about the hostages, so it's not that exciting and interesting. Sometimes that's how it happens with news. But, part of being a journalist, you and I know, is being creative and looking for the stories. And the hostage story is an important one. And whether you're just telling, you could just tell the story of who these people were and what kinds of lives they led. And you don't have to have something new about hostage exchanges or releases in order to talk about them.
And I guess my next question would be, where do you think the media deficits are in general when it comes to this war?
I think that there's a lot of sort of equivalency being drawn when people look at the numbers, right? And they'll say how many Israelis were killed, how many were injured, et cetera. And then you look in Gaza. And the difference is that Hamas went into residential villages, okay, the villages that are not quote unquote settlements. This would have been wrong no matter where they did it in Israel, but people should know that these are not settlements, that if you think that those towns are not legitimate, then you think the state of Israel shouldn't exist, because most of them have been around, the whole time. They have nothing to do with the quote unquote settlements. In any case, they went into these civilian residential villages, burned down houses with people alive inside them, gunned people, mutilated people, tortured them before killing them, often in front of their children. I mean, I don't want to get into the details because they're horrible and graphic, but Secretary of State Blinken did testifying before Congress today on the day we recorded, and you can look up that video. Even he spoke about some of the most terrible cases that took place. Israel, on the other hand, is trying to hunt down a terrorist organization that is hiding behind civilians. So they intentionally go out and murder civilians, and then they use the civilians who live in Gaza to hide behind. The Hamas headquarters are under a hospital in Gaza. It's called the Shifa Hospital. Shifa means like healing in Arabic. And instead of healing, they're using it to, literally to cover, because it's right on top of their headquarters, right? So Israel has not attacked that hospital and that headquarters, but Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties. Out of the million, believe it's 1.1 million people who live in northern Gaza, 800,000 have already evacuated. And that's the difference. In Israel, you have many, many tens of thousands of people who evacuated from Israel's south and also by Israel's northern border, where the Iranian proxy Hezbollah has been shelling. And they are evacuated after the attacks. In Israel has been trying to get Gazans to evacuate before the attacks because they don't want to strike civilians.
I do now want to pivot to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Over the weekend, he said that Israel is entering the second phase of this war and it's going to be long and difficult. What's your reaction to that?
So I think a lot of Israelis were waiting to find out when this ground operation would begin, and there were a few things that happened before, which is, first, there were all sorts of targets struck by air, and intelligence was being gathered. I think it's understandable that it would take a few weeks to get ready, and my understanding is that, after 9/11, it took the U.S. longer to invade Afghanistan, though that's, the other side of the world, but, it takes time. So now the ground invasion has started. And I think everyone knows that it's not easy to just, it's not a one and done. You're not going to just, go in there and leave after a few days and then you'll be rid of Hamas. I mean, if it was easy to get rid of Hamas, Israel would have done it already, right? If we wouldn't have waited until the absolute worst case nightmare scenario before we went in and did it. So, Israelis unfortunately have some experience with long wars, including the first war in Lebanon in the 1980s. And it looks like we might experience something like that again.
And what's the sentiment around Netanyahu specifically? Are people rallying around him, supporting him? Because I know you said that this was a unifying moment for your country earlier, or are people kind of putting the blame on him?
Yeah, I think that there are sort of two things going on, which is that the country, the maybe civilians isn't the right word, but the civil sort of efforts of everyday Israelis have been very, very uniting. And across all sectors of society, you see Haredi, ultra-Orthodox men, now signing up to enlist in the army in droves, even though they are exempted from the mandatory draft in Israel. Thousands of them in the past few weeks have signed up. And you see all kinds of, there were groups that were protesting against the government. I'm sure you know that this year there were mass protests, weekly protests in Israel, and they have used their very impressive logistical capabilities to help the families of hostages and the families of people who were killed and injured in the Hamas attack. So you really see the society uniting. At the same time, polling shows that 86% of Israelis blame Netanyahu, or at least think he is at fault here. I don't remember the exact wording of the question. And I think there's a sense, and this is something that I hear again and again in people interviewed on the radio, on TV, and things like that, where they just feel that the government failed. And so we, the people, have to step up and do things for ourselves. And that's not a good situation. And I think that, the leadership is going to have to pay for that in one way or another. I hear more and more voices calling for Netanyahu to resign. I don't think that it's reached a point where there is a serious discussion of that happening right now in the very beginning of this war that Netanyahu would resign. But I think, there have been many, many times when people have said Netanyahu's days are numbered and they were wrong. I have a feeling that this time the people saying that will be right.
Do you think his days are numbered? Like, how long are his days numbered? I guess I would ask. You said that the leadership will pay for this, but will the people of Israel hold off on that until the war is more under control?
I think so. Yeah. This might be a very long war. So I don't know that it will wait to the end of the war, but I think that we are still in the beginning. I mean, just like you quoted Netanyahu as saying, and Israelis are going to have patience and going to have to continue being united on the home front for a while. That being said, for the past 50 years, after every war in Israel, there has been an official commission of inquiry, and there have been people who have had to resign over, not being prepared for the war or how they conducted themselves during the war. And I don't expect this to be any different, because I think Israelis across the political spectrum are disappointed and angry in how this government conducted itself. And by the way, also its predecessors. I mean, Netanyahu has been prime minister for most of basically since 2009, with the exception of a year and a half, right? But even in that year and a half, they didn't change the way they looked at Hamas. And there's also a long line of defense ministers and chiefs of staff of the IDF who all had the same policy. So, we're talking about Netanyahu. He's the top of the pyramid and he has to take responsibility. But there are a lot of people who were wrong here.
I do now want to pivot a little bit and talk about the really scary incidents of anti-Semitism we've seen worldwide since October 7th. In the United States alone, we've seen a rise of anti-Semitism all across college campuses, including elite universities. What do you make of that?
I'm never surprised by anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, it's been a fact of life for the Jewish people throughout our history. But I think the magnitude of it is something that we haven't seen in a very long time. And I also just think that seeing, what looks like regular American college kids saying things like glory to the martyrs makes me wonder, when did so many Americans decide to join a death cult? Right? I mean, that's what Hamas is. That's what glory to the martyrs is. People who, would commit suicide in order to kill as many Jews as possible. And so it's the combination of the anti-Semitism and then just the deep, deep nihilism that I wonder what has gone wrong on these campuses and what they're teaching people. It's horrifying. It's horrifying that Jews should have to feel this way. Anywhere in the world. And it's horrifying. I see many Jews who, most Jews are liberal politically in the US, right? Most Jews vote Democrat. And I see so many people who fall under those categories suddenly being disillusioned and finding people who they thought were friends suddenly saying things that are, if not pro Hamas, then sort of making excuses or apologetic. And they're saying, we feel like we're threatened here and we want support. And many of them feel that they're not getting it. That being said, of course, President Biden is a Democrat and he is really standing very strongly with Israel.
To your point, I've talked to and have read pieces about many progressive Jewish people who do feel disillusioned right now because they're saying, hey, I've stood up for causes X, Y, and Z, and now it's my turn and I feel like no one's really standing up for me. So what's your message to them, A, and what's your message to people on college campuses? Like you said, the Glory to the Martyrs image was projected on George Washington University campus. What's your message to those college kids too who are supporting these types of messages?
I think and hope a lot of them are ignorant, but they should realize that what they are saying and what they are supporting is hate and violent hate, and people who stand against really everything that progressives theoretically stand for. Hamas is not for diversity, equity, and inclusion in any way, shape, or form. The people, there's groups that call themselves queers for Palestine. What does Hamas do to queers? They hang them, or they tie them to the back of trucks and drive the trucks down the street and kill them that way. And that has happened in Gaza. It doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense if you look at the world in some sort of twisted binary of oppressor and oppressed, which doesn't make sense either because Hamas is oppressing the Palestinian people in the most obvious way. But they look at it that Israel is a strong, successful country and therefore they must be the oppressor. I'm sure that there are plenty of people out there who truly are anti-Semitic and truly have a problem with the Jewish people, and those people maybe are not the ones who the message needs to go out to because they are just maybe hopeless. But the people who think that they're supporting a progressive cause and so they're just going to go along with it because other progressives are there, they should know that they're wrong. They should know that this is a fascist cause.
Lahav, before I let you go, I do want to know what you're looking out for next. We're a little over 3 weeks after October 7th, and as you sit there, what's next?
Well, we just started the ground invasion. I think we expect it to continue for a while. We're hopeful that this will include some rescues of the hostages, like we saw this week already, and that is, what we'll see going forward. It remains to be seen. I mean, there's the northern front, right? Hezbollah has been shelling Israel, and Israel has been sort of limiting its retaliatory strikes. But if Hezbollah expands its attacks on Israel, then Israel will also respond in kind. The hope is that doesn't happen.
Thank you so much for your insights. I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you.